Okay, so some people told me about this post on Reddit by JAlexander, and basically he's saying a lot of the things that I've been saying about randomly generated things being uninteractive and unhealthy, and there needs to be some sort of way to have skill implemented in it for the opponent, you know? So, like, I don't have to just guess what they have in their hand. There's got to be something that I can do that could potentially, like, allow me to play around it. So they told me that I should read this. I will have the link to the entire post, although I will be reading most of it to you right now. But go drop it a little upvote if you want. And I'm just going to basically go over everything. So, hey all, JAlexander back again talking about the generation mechanics, some of the least interactive ones in the game that currently exist. I'm sure many of you are thinking that mechanics like charge and stealth are less interactive, right? Allow me to convince you otherwise. It's an all too common scenario to be playing a game of Hearthstone, feel like you have everything wrapped up, having the rug pulled out from under you by some card carrying the words created by under them. It can feel truly awful to deal with and leave you feeling like there wasn't much you could have done. We've all been there before. Just to be upfront, I'm not saying that playing with card generation isn't skill or can't be skill testing. Sometimes it can be, sometimes it might not be. Like many other cards and effects in Hearthstone, navigating your way through a bunch of random resources successfully can involve a lot of decision making. So yes, obviously he says right here for the opponent, but basically what he's saying here is that even though a ton of this stuff is randomly generated, there are a lot of times basically where you aren't given good options. Let's just say I'm the player randomly generating a ton of stuff, right? Let's just say I'm a priest. There'll be a lot of cases where you won't actually randomly generate a ton of good things, but you have to somehow use the resources that you got to get to the end goal of you winning, right? So it does have some skill expression. It can be a little bit all over the place with as much random generation that is in the game right now, but I do understand and agree with what he's saying that it can be skill testing. So let's just continue. What I am saying, however, is that the extent of a lot of random cards and generation is skill testing. It's mostly skill testing for the player generating the cards. That's what I was saying. As the person who's playing against it, I have no idea what they have. And the thing that tests skill for card games generally is you need to play around the cards that you know that they have. But if you are playing against the guy that randomly generates a ton of stuff, you can no longer get those reads, right? Like if I'm playing against a priest, I'm like, okay, if he's playing a Highlander priest, he already used his shadow word death, so now all he has is like Zephyrus or Zephyrus. But then he randomly discovers some cards, gets another shadow word death, and there's no way I could play around that because I played around what I had the knowledge of. When you generate cards, so I'm just going to continue. When you generate cards, you have all the knowledge. You pick from them, discover the option. You can play how you're going, or you can plan how you're going to use them on future turns. On the most basic level, you know what cards you made and what your new range is. The person doing the card generation is in the driver's seat. Also, this includes lackeys with like dragons and spells and stuff like that. Those two primarily, but maybe he'll talk about that as well. But what about your opponent? That player is much more takes on the role of a passive recipient. Knowing the range of an opponent's deck has always been skill testing aspect of the game. That's what I'm saying earlier. I play around what I think he has. Like if I know he's playing Highlander and he played one card, then I'm like, okay, then he probably doesn't have another one. Or if he played both Breath of the Infinites, I'm like, okay, he probably doesn't have another board wipe or something like that. So that's what the skill testing is as the opponent. But when that range begins to include some number of new things, from almost none to approximately a full additional dex worth, that skill can be correspondingly constrained. So yeah, the reason why I said you can create an entire dex worth, literally I've seen tempo mages create 3 evocations and then 2 mana cyclones with I think like 5 to 6 cards each. And that's almost an entire deck's worth of randomly generated stuff that you don't know how to play around. Or you can't really play around. If you know what decks are you're likely to face on the ladder, you can build a deck to counter the meta. Yes. This is possible for mechanics like stealth or charge. You can have healing or taunt for charge, and you can have non-target damage effects like AoE or things like cleave and stuff for stealth. This is true. On the other hand, it is not particularly possible to build a deck that counters lots of random card generation because, well, it's random, and you don't, like, your opponent doesn't know what they're going to get either, right? So it's literally, how do you counter something when your opponent doesn't even know what's going to happen? Let alone you. You don't know what you have to counter. While you can't try to counter a deck's main game plan, or while you can try to counter a deck's main game plan, you can't counter random elements nearly as well. Similarly, if you know what you're likely to face on the ladder, you can play around opposing tools and properly utilize your resources. However, it's also not particularly possible to play around lots of options that could be created over the course of a game, as playing around one option often means playing around another, or playing into another. Yeah, so just to clarify that, this is a thing that I do all the time, and sometimes you'll get a misread, right? But if you're playing into a certain deck, you're going to be like, okay, he didn't play this turn, so I'm going to assume he doesn't have it and go wide. Or like playing into a rogue or whatever, I'm going to be like, okay, he didn't backstab one thing earlier on, so I'm going to play this 3-2 so I can apply pressure on the board even though I play into the backstab. So this is using knowledge that I already had. That was just an example I pulled off the top of my head. But it's very hard to do that when your opponent basically generates options over the course of an entire game to the point where most of their hand is randomly generated, if not all of their hand is randomly generated, and you have no information at all. When options for creating even one-cost spells can be as wide as deal 3 random damage to deal or add 10 random spells to your hand, that doesn't leave nearly as much room for utilizing the understanding of matches in a game-to-game basis. That's another thing. The power level of some of these one-cost spells can be astronomical. Like, Evocation's insane. Some cards can be good and used early on to like control the board. Others are literal 1-mana win conditions. If you're creating a lot of stuff, then this leaves the opponent very much the position of, guess I'll just ignore the fact that random cards exist, make the best play to my knowledge I do have, or make the best play with the knowledge I do have about their deck, and hope that it works out. That's basically what I said. Like, you have to play around something and be like, oh, they randomly discovered another Soul Mirror? Well, I'd already played around one, or they already played the first one, so how was I supposed to know that they'd have another? It's usually the win rate maximizing play anyway. Oh, wait, because that's about all that they can do, and it's usually the win rate maximizing play anyway, because at least you are using all the information that you have access to make the best play to your knowledge. Over the long run, that will on average be your highest win rate play. Just play around the standard range of the opponent's deck and hope that you don't randomly get punished by AoE or just some burst damage they don't start the game with access to. After all, playing around a potential random AoE effect from their deck naturally contains an AoE effect when their deck naturally contains none can play into random single target removal instead. That's also true. Because when you try to play around one thing, you could end up playing into another. Like a randomly generated thing like Breath of the Infinite or Holy Nova versus like, say, Penance or Holy Smite. You could play into one by not playing into another, but you can't tell because it's all random. Since there's often no good reason to assume a random spell might be AoE or burst or single target removal, the correct play can be to play around nothing. Because you have no information, you can't just play around everything, so might as well play around nothing and just play your game plan, basically. This is the core of what makes the created by mechanic non-interactive. It's something that one player does and gets to think about, and something that the other, and then something that happens to the other player, where they don't get to like decide anything at all. Skills in deck building or meta knowledge get circumvented. The more things get created, the larger the range of created by things, the less interactive the mechanic becomes. That's true. So it's like exponential. Like one randomly discovered thing, okay. You can maybe guess what they got. Like, okay, they needed AoE in this situation. Maybe they discovered an AoE card. But in Mage's case, when their entire hand is discovered by, it goes from like, okay, one card you have to think about maybe playing around to their entire hand. You have no idea what it could be. It doesn't have to be this way, of course. Not that Discover needs to be changed, but here are 4 possible ways Discover mechanic could work. And I already read these, but I have one last one that I think would be pretty interesting. The opponent sees neither of the opponent's options nor the choice, like now, which is what they currently have. The option, or the opponent sees the discovered card, so you know what you have to play around. The opponent sees at least the options offered, so you at least have a good idea on what they picked, but not certain. Or the opponent sees both the options and the choice. I'd say probably the best one would probably be this. So that way the opponent would still have to figure out what the opponent had to play. But I guess this one would also be good. I think seeing this would be a little bit overkill. But that's just me. So probably one of these two middle options is good. But in my opinion, I think another good option would literally be print cards or make cards that counter that style. Say like, you know the Mana Giant, it gets cheaper if you played cards that weren't in your hand. And like Sorcerer's Apprentice makes cards cost 1 less. Basically make a card that reads like cards that didn't start in your deck cost 3 more while this card is on the battlefield. Or like a Battle Cry. You know, something like that to play around it to specifically beat that. Right? So I feel like any of these options could be extremely good. Oh wow, this keeps going on. Wow, there's a lot more. All these options have different implementations or implications for how games play out, how interactive the mechanic is, and how skill testing it is, the power and how exciting and frustrating and satisfying it can be. They're definitely things to think about. Now, in recent interviews, Ixar has suggested that the created by mechanic is at the peak of what we could expect to see, and we should expect it to be confined to a certain classes more moving forward in an effort to make it feel more like a class identity. I don't want it to be a class identity. I want it to be overall reduced. Hopefully, it's a mix of both, where they reduce it across the board and then give it as an identity to another class or a couple of classes like, say, Rogue, Mage, and Priest, because they already have it the most right now. But then also shrink it in those classes. So that way they still have it, but they don't have so much of it. Regardless of whether we want to consider random an identity or not, simply confining the mechanics predominantly to one handful of classes like Mage, Rogue, and or Priest. Oh, wow. Okay, we had the same idea there. Doesn't fundamentally do anything about how non-interactive it can be. No, yeah, like that's another, like that's why I want it to shrink overall. Like sure, you can have it be limited to those 3 classes, but if it isn't shrinked overall within those classes as well, it's still going to have the same uninteractive problems that it already has. So it just might mean those classes gain reputations for being frustrating at random times, or frustratingly random at times, and they make opponents feel like they couldn't reasonably play around things. And that's probably why Mage and Priest, as of right now, are the 2 most hated classes in the game, with like maybe Druid thrown in there somewhere. Like, with so much random generation, the fact that Blizzard hasn't addressed this or done anything else to stop this is problematic. I will say, the fact that they did make cards that discover not be able to discover themselves was a good change, so they did stop potential, like, cycling combos. That was very helpful. I will give Blizzard credit for that one, but they need to do more. That's just my opinion on this. And like when 2 of the classes in the game, the 2 classes that have this mechanic the most, are literally the most hated, there's a problem. Personally, I think that's how it is. But we're gonna continue reading. I'm trying to be as unbiased as possible when reading this, but I am letting my emotions get in here a little bit, so I apologize. With that in mind, I also wanted to look at some common points in favor of the created by mechanic, and why players feel like it's good for the game. Created by card generation makes the game feel different. Now, this is true, and this is why I've said on multiple occasions I do like some random mechanics, some RNG. I think that random mechanics are interesting. Even way back in the day of literally just Mad Bomber. He was my boy. I would pick him every single time in Arena just because it was fun to see where the 3 damage would go. It wasn't super high impact, but it could pay off super well sometimes. It could punish me sometimes. It could be okay sometimes. And then there were other times when you could just discover or randomly get like 1 minion where you didn't even get to discover. And that was usually fine as well, because it was usually just 1 or 2 cards. And like I said, and like he said earlier, it's exponential. The more that you discover, the less interactive it becomes. So if you're able to discover like 1, 2, or 3 things maybe over the course of an entire game, it's a lot easier and more fun to deal with. Or I guess less toxic to deal with, than like tons. For me, it's not particularly true. When a game is decided by a lackey making a spell for lethal, I don't feel the game was lost to that spell. I feel like the game was lost to the lackey or the miscreant or whatever made the lackey. When a game is lost to a flurry of mage-generated cards, I don't feel like I lost to a Flame Strike. I feel like I lost to the Mana Cyclone, who randomly generated the Flame Strike. And that's another thing, the whole fact that, like, you don't feel like you lost to the player. You don't feel like you got out-skilled. You feel like you got out-lucked, and that's just not a good way to play a card game, because card games already have a decent amount of luck in them just because you have to draw cards. As the generator cards are always in these decks, games against them don't end up feeling very different. That's true. That's another thing. It makes games feel different and unique, but that's not true. It's just like, okay, he's comboing off again, he's gonna win. Or, okay, the priest randomly generated a ton of minions and a ton of spells. Like, even though technically the spells might be a little different each time, the feel is the same. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'll keep reading. Games against them don't end up feeling very different. It more feels like the same game as usual against that archetype, as a broad game plans are generally similar from match to match. But now I'm taking that typical match and also rolling the dice to see if something I shouldn't have to play around or anticipate in the first place ends up punishing me. While created cards might make games feel different for the pilot of the deck, it's not clear that feeling translates as well to the opponent. Created by card generation is good for free-to-play players. The idea here is that many players don't have full collections and can't play with cards they want. These cards that make random cards are good for the type of player, good for this type of player because it lets them play with cards they otherwise wouldn't be able to. While this is true, that's more a criticism of how expensive the game is for most players. Saying random generation is good for players without many cards is more using the mechanic to justify the current pricing model of the game, which I've already gone over is bad, and I really, really hope that the Battlegrounds is made better as well. Or not Battlegrounds, the Battle Pass. Battlegrounds is fine. Battle Pass is made better, so that way this argument doesn't need to be made. If a player has access to better collection for less time and money, they would actually be able to play decks with more cards that they wanted rather than randomly generated ones. I will say right now that that point is definitely true. Pretty much every time I make a budget deck, let's just take Budget Bomb Warrior for example, if I'm not able to run Karagath or the Doctor, I run Athletic Studies to discover a rush minion, so that way it will cost one less. Like, I actually believe that this thing is true, and he's saying that as well. He's just saying that it also can be taken as a way to criticize Blizzard's current model, which is problematic in my opinion, but we've been over that, it's fine. Created by mechanic is simply fun to play with. That's totally fine if you like it. There's no doubt that a certain group of players really do enjoy just logging into a card-based casino and rolling the dice a few times, seeing what wacky things happen. And I don't blame people for that either. Trust me, there have been times where I have also enjoyed this kind of game. I play pretty much every deck you can think of. I've played pretty much every deck you can think of because I have all of the cards and I try to do it for content. And I'll admit, it can be kind of fun to pop off with a cool evocation, summon a ton of 5/5s with Chenvala, get a mana giant out, or do any number of things with Mage, or randomly generate the perfect card for Priest. But I also try to keep in mind how unfair it is for the opponent, because I know how frustrating it is for it to happen to me. So like, that's part of the reason why, even though it's fun for a portion of people that play it, it's very unfun for everybody who has to play against it. And people can have fun doing any number of things, or they'll still have fun even if the RNG mechanic is like reeled in a little bit. So anyway, for that purpose, or those players should absolutely be catered to and supported. And that's the thing. For that purpose, there is an entire game mode of Tavern Brawl, for instance, for just casual fun. I don't necessarily think RNG should be limited to just casual fun. I think that RNG in a card game, especially a computerized card game like Hearthstone, no other games can really utilize RNG to the extent that Hearthstone can. Like, Legends of Runeterra can, and some other games can. But, like, Hearthstone was the first game to be fully virtual and actually be able to take advantage of these things. And I think they should totally run with some RNG. Like I said multiple times, I think that it could be potentially good. That being said, I also think that too much is bad. And I don't think, and I understand when people say that they like this kind of style because it is fairly fun to play. I'm not I don't want to make it seem like I don't understand why people play randomly generated things. I do understand that it's fun for a lot of people, but I just don't like the mechanic as a whole. That said, if rank ladder is more your thing, but you still want tons of randomness in your games, the odds are likely good that winning games isn't high a priority. In that respect, cards that make random cards could be made at power levels that simply leave them not particularly competitive. That way, players can use lots of cards and randomly generating things if that's their jam, but it does less to take away from those players looking to have a more interactive and competitive experience. This last part I moderately disagree with, because I don't think that you should just hard nerf an entire style of play and just make cards, but also make them without the idea of them being played competitively. I think that they should exist, and yes, some of them need a nerf. Like Thought Steal shouldn't be able to generate 2 cards from your opponent's deck for 2 mana, especially considering every card in your opponent's deck is a good card. So essentially it's a draw 2 for 2, and your opponent has no idea what they could be, right? That should be 3 mana. So some cards should be nerfed, and Thought Steal would still be viable if it was 3 mana. I will have you know. But I think what should happen is just the number of them should be less. Like, I don't know. I feel like what he's saying is partially correct, and it shouldn't be so prominent in a competitive experience, but I don't think it should be totally taken out either, because it's something unique to Hearthstone. I do understand it is fun for some people, and if some people do want to play ranked and also have some RNG, they shouldn't go into a game automatically expecting to lose. They should at least have a chance, but they should have less of those cards that randomly generate, so that way matchups are more skill-based. That's basically everything that has to be said. I'm not going to go into the comments about all of this. I just basically read JAlexander's post on this. I agree with most of the points. I do think that some of his responses are a bit extreme. I really liked his point about the created by is good for free-to-play players, because it actually addresses something that's a problem with the whole system. I don't necessarily agree with this one. I don't think people should be punished for wanting to play this way. I just think that they shouldn't be able to play it to such an extent. And making games feel different, it's both true and not true, because it is technically different, but the general game plan is the same. I liked his solutions. These middle two were the best, with the opponent seeing the discovered card and the opponent seeing the options offered being the optimal ones, with my card idea potentially being like a neutral card that says cards that were randomly discovered, or cards that didn't start in your deck cost extra. That could also be a pretty interesting card, and I basically agree with most of the things that he said. I've watched him stream before. He's talked about this. I've talked about most of this stuff on my stream, so you already know my thoughts on this. But I tried to be as objective with this as possible, but it just seems very objectively bad. Like, I don't know. I'm trying to be unbiased and not trying to be like, oh, it's just unfun to play against, but it literally, like, takes out skill in the game for people who have to play around random things, or it makes it so hard to play around everything for the opponent, even if they are skilled. Like, it can be bad because they'll overthink things, right? Like, I don't know. Randomly generated things don't reward good players if the good player is the opponent of the person randomly generating things. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed. I like this kind of topic. I love doing these discussions. They're very fun to me. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one. Check out Twitch in the description. Also, like, comment, subscribe, ask questions if you want, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.